I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it is a delight to welcome you all here to our little city on a hill, our campus here in Malibu for this Quest for Community conference. Before we get our program underway, I thought it might be important to give a little background as to how we're here. And then just touch on two questions that you might be thinking about. There are things that certainly are important to me as we plan this conference, and those questions are: why does a policy school care about community? And why is this line of inquiry, this perspective on our politics and policy, why is it important in 2022? So let me just start with a little bit of background. There are people who were here 5 years ago when we launched something called the American Project. It began with a gathering of about 35 thinkers, scholars, policymakers, activists on our Malibu campus to explore and discuss what was happening within the conservative movement in the wake of the 2016 election. That series of meetings, small and large group of that larger group in June of 2017 resulted in a document called A Way Forward. And that document, a 4-page essentially argument for the importance of at least exploring, if not framing, a more communitarian perspective on our policy and politics, begins with this paragraph. And I just wanted to quote this to you. The American political system suffers from a serious but treatable disorder. We see the most obvious symptoms easily enough, ranging from political polarization and radicalization to apathy and civic disengagement, leading many to wonder if we are coming apart. The malady itself is a profound, pervasive alienation, where citizens have lost our connections to politics and to each other. We are experiencing a modern loneliness so acute as to threaten what we call the American Project. Now, just to finish out this definition of what brings us here, what is the American Project? That appears defined in the next paragraph of this document. The American Project represents the distilled core of a long American tradition, and it is the essential common ground of our national understanding, one that invites all into a connective history and a set of rights and responsibilities. With deep roots in Western civilization, the American Project is grounded in the conviction that the capacity for self-government is a source of distinctly human dignity, one that in America produced an exceptional and peculiarly American governing document, the U.S. Constitution. Related, this right and ability to pursue happiness requires energetic social and political institutions, from schools and houses of worship to workplaces and political parties, to supply moral order and to speak to our deep human needs for virtue and belonging. The collapse of these community-building institutions has led directly to a severe questioning of what it means to be an American, with a looming threat of losing any sense of our common American identity. That was back in 2017, and I look back at the date of some of the back and forth because several of the people in this room here helped to compose this A Way Forward document. It's been almost exactly 5 years to the day. October 27th, 2017 was when the final version of this A Way Forward document was written. And I don't know if it strikes you the same way that it strikes me, but it feels like this document could have been written 15 minutes ago. that first gathering and that A Way Forward document framing the beginnings of what might be called a reimagined communitarian movement for the 21st century has continued over the last 5 years in events, essays, particularly an essay series at the website Real Clear Politics, a number of discussions in Washington, D.C., led by the co-director of the American Project, Rich Taffel, who is here and was really formative in helping to organize this first series of conversations. But I have to say, and Rich will back me up on this, how surprising it is to find ourselves here having this discussion 5 years after we first gathered. That first meeting of the American Project Group in June of 2017 was one of the hardest things I've ever done professionally. And the reason that it was so difficult was I had no idea, given the people that we had invited, where this conversation or series of conversations was going to go. Remember, this was in the wake of the 2016 election. And we had pro-Trumpers and anti-Trumpers and never-Trumpers. We had libertarians. We had more communitarian-minded folks. We had the beginnings of some national conservatives, even though that wasn't even a thing back in 2017. And even though I had my own feelings about where I was hoping this was going to go, and I know Rich did as well, I thought we were true to the purpose in which we called everyone here back then, which was to see where it goes, to have open-ended conversations about the future of the American conservative movement and what it might mean for today's politics. At the end of 2.5 days of discussions, we reconvened everybody in a room just directly across the Gulls Way patio to kind of debrief and see, like, what were some of the themes that came out in some of the small group conversations? What were some of the topics that came out that we might distill down? And beginning with Josh Mitchell, who is here, in many ways the intellectual godfather of this effort, we began to see a consensus around that the issues we were facing in the country were not so much political, but they were cultural. And the cultural issues that we were seeing were ones of alienation and loneliness. This was 2017. And that our politics and policy were essentially both contributing to this alienation as it was a result of this alienation. The people were seeking affiliation in very tribal ways, but they were doing that in response to a larger cultural movement that was happening. And that unless we understood that cultural piece, looking just at politics and analyzing politics was only operating downstream of really where the issues were. And that led to this other series of conversations, also led by someone who is not with us, gathered with us here today, but needs to be recognized, Dr. Ted McAllister, who is one of our faculty here at the Policy School, a historian who contributed greatly to this A Way Forward document. That there might be an opportunity to think in ways that harken back to a period in American politics in the early to late 90s, in which there had been a time in which this communitarian movement, one that cut across parties, had different definitions, whether you were on the left and right, but had a number of people, both scholars, policymakers, leaders, that were understanding that American politics is understood best at the local level, and it's understood best when we concentrate and focus on the importance of mediating institutions as part and parcel of this American project. It is through these mediating institutions, whether they be small charter schools, faith-based organizations working on poverty, business-oriented nonprofits in communities, that provide this sense not only of affiliation, but an opportunity to engage in real serious policy issues. And so in economics, we have this term crowding out, which is this understanding that when public sector, especially centralized state or federal policymaking institutions get involved in policy issues that are often very localized, they tend to crowd out these local, nonprofit, civic and civil society institutions. And so why is it important that a policy school is hosting something like this? I think it's fair to say that this group here, I would guess that many have never set foot on a policy school campus before. I know some have. And I know there's not another conversation like this going on in another policy school in America. In many ways, as we celebrate our 25th anniversary here at Pepperdine, much of the work we do can be grounded in our founding. That founding was led in many ways by the late great social scientist James Q. Wilson, who taught here for the last dozen years of his life as our Reagan professor, but was also part of the Blue Ribbon panel that helped to design our unique liberal arts quantitative mixed curriculum. And even though he was regarded as a pretty hardened social scientist, a quant, at the time in which he was engaged to lead many of the conversations about the founding of the policy school in the mid-90s, he had just come off writing what he considered his most important book, The Moral Sense. And it was in The Moral Sense that Wilson understands that many of the factors contributing to whether public policy succeeded or failed were difficult to quantify. And many of those factors had to do with these mediating social institutions and local cultures that needed to be accounted for, that the policy answer that would work in Malibu was not going to work in Athens, Georgia. And the policy answer that would work in Athens, Georgia was not going to work in Athens, Greece. Now we know that intuitively, but it was Wilson who came to understand and really discuss and explore in The Moral Sense that policymakers really needed to focus on these cultural, historical, and civic elements of public policy if they were going to create public policy that was going to be sustained. And to understand that well meant a training not only in the quantitative aspects of public policy, in stats and econometrics and so forth, but also in the cultural and historical aspects, which is why we have a great books course here in our core. It's why we have a course called Roots of American Order in our core, because our students need to understand and see policy from a 360-degree perspective. To understand, yes, you need to understand policy from a quantitative standpoint, but also through these lenses of history and culture. Of course, the title of this conference is derived from the important, pivotal work by the late Robert Nisbet, a Californian, someone who grew up not really too far from here in Redlands, Claremont area of California, went on for his doctoral work and began teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and then returned home to head up the political science department of what was then the new campus at the University of California at Riverside. And in his book, The Quest for Community, which was published in 1953, a thought as we approach 2023, maybe we could be thinking about other anniversary celebration opportunities for that. He wrote this to begin one of the chapters, quote, "Modern public administration has been generally dominated by the 19th century rationalist conception of society as a vast aggregate of unconnected political particles. Who are political particles? We are political particles. It was Nisbet's understanding, and certainly James Q. Wilson's understanding as discussed in The Moral Sense. And I also would say, I have it on some authority, that at the first gathering of the Blue Ribbon Committee to discuss the creation of the School of Public Policy, Wilson's first question to the assembled group was, what is public policy? As simple as that question is, it really depends on where you put your emphasis. Is it what is public policy, or what is public policy? Now, for Wilson, in asking that question, he wanted to make sure that this was going to be a place that understood that latter emphasis, that this was going to be a program that understood the public part of public policy. And as trite as that may sound, it makes all the difference in the world. I would argue that we still have a number of graduate policy programs. Pepperdine is only one of about 240 graduate policy programs in the United States, that much of their emphasis is on the policy part of public policy. In the understanding that somehow policymakers are dealing with masses of people. They're dealing with political particles and not human beings with their own stories, living in their own cultures, and dealing with their own histories. And so the School of Public Policy, this is actually, in many ways, a demonstration. This conference here is a demonstration of who we are. That we care deeply about the public part of public policy, and how we actually understand that is to explore how the public in the American project experience directly engages in something we call public policy making. And so as we look through the agenda for this, we are going to be raising a number of questions, beginning with our first panel on the role of local government. Then we're going to take a look at communitarian thinkers, many of those from the 20th century, and look at their relevance for today. I'm excited about our luncheon talk by the aforementioned Josh Mitchell, who will be looking at Tocqueville and democracy in modern America. That will be followed by probably the most subdued panel, given what I've heard from that table in the back, what the Black community can teach us about community, led by the legendary Bob Woodson. We will then conclude the afternoon with a discussion on social capital, led by someone else who was there at the very beginning of this American project, Ryan Streeter. Then I hope you can all join us for a networking reception just up Coast Highway from here at Spruzzo's, and then we gather here again tomorrow morning for 2 more panels looking at faith-based institutions and their work in community building, a discussion led by the co-director of the American Project, Rich Taffel, on loneliness and the implications, the costs of broken community, and then concluding with a conversation between me and Grace Olmstead about her book Uprooted and what a community-focused politics might look like today. Let me just close by saying why I think this series of conversations is important today. For the same reason that those first 2 paragraphs that I read from the A Way Forward document, I think could have been written 15 years ago, or 15 minutes ago. I think this conversation speaks to a time when we are experiencing levels of polarization, loneliness, and alienation that we have not seen since the 1960s. And in so many ways, we have politicized everything and we have federalized everything. And missing in that is a genuine American conversation about what we, not as political particles, but what we as self-governing Americans can do to respond to policy issues that impact our lives and the communities in which we live. And I think this, as the title of that A Way Forward document argues, this is the way forward. As many Americans question the state of our politics, what's going to happen after next Tuesday, whether, as some say, there will even be a democracy left, whatever that means. There will be an America left, and there will be Americans left. It's on us, right? It's on us the way America looks after this election. And I hope that if anything you derive out of this, well, I hope for two things. One, I hope there are new relationships built here. As you see at the bottom of the cover of this program, what began as a annually funded initiative here called the American Project was endowed earlier this year by Adam and Chandra Melton with a $10 million gift to create what is now the Mies Institute for Liberty and the American Project. So resources have been put behind the importance of this conversation going forward. But I hope new relationships are built here going forward. And I hope it's inspiring. Rich, I don't know about you and maybe some of the others, Josh and Ryan, there are some times where I'll just speak for myself. There have been times over the course of these 5 years where I'm wondering, am I just nuts raising this communitarian view of politics? Is this just like woo-woo, kind of too theoretical? Is it really relevant in a time when politics have become a true contact sport? And by that I mean a sport, not a thing where people are deciding things for the better of their communities. And seeing this group, but also just there have happened a number of times, and I would say this especially speaking with 20-somethings. We have a couple of them here in the room, and more will be joining throughout today and tomorrow, that they realize that something is not right in American politics right now. That there needs to be a different way of understanding the American project and their place in it. Because the places that they currently see for themselves in American politics are not places they want to be. So I hope some of this over the next day and a half is also inspirational. Because I really do believe that this view, which is contested, this is a contested view of the importance of the American project and how we've just defined it, and the prospects for a more communitarian conservatism, a more communitarian politics. Needs to be defended. And not just defended, promoted. And not just promoted, taking back ground so that more Americans can understand and feel connected to and feel called into this American project. So I want to thank you all for participating in this. As today is Friday, where we do have some classes. I know we're going to have more students, but I just wanted to call out students that we have here. If you could raise your hand. Some of our graduate policy students are here. More will be joining. But let's get into our first panel. I want to call up my friend Michael Hendricks, who was also there at the founding of the American Project, along with Kevin, Seth, and Soledad.
Thank you for setting forth the vision for today, but also for kicking off this entire panel, this discussion. It's just such an honor to be here with so many friendly faces and to see the arc of that story of what has been built here over the past 5 years. It's just incredible. And I'm also honored to be with this panel here. But first, just to kick us off, we get the honor of kicking off this Quest for Community discussion and begin it right at home, at the local level, with our families. I think when COVID hit, we didn't quite realize just how much time we'd be spending at home with our families or longing for home and a family. Little did we know how much local rules would matter, local governance and decisions at the local level would matter to what kind of life we could live or couldn't live, how our kids are going to be taught or not get taught, or what kind of challenges we'd face day to day, from crime to disorder to cost of living. Local matters a lot. And one theme I keep coming back to as well, families matter. And I don't just mean the 1990s show Family Matters, if you remember that show, although that was a classic. But families matter to a healthy society. And when they aren't flourishing or can't flourish, we all suffer. James Wilson, who's one of the OG founding fathers, he was also one of only 6 that signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he called marriage and family life, quote, the true origin of society, and argued that it thus mattered greatly to the success of the American project. I think all the more reason than today that, and I'll just quote from National Review here, this is a recent piece with a lot of authors, I think some of whom are in this room. And they said, quote, at a time when cultural, political, and economic trends have pushed marriage and fertility rates to record lows, it is crucial for policymakers to have a clear vision of how public policy might better support family life. Thus, this conversation today. So what can communities do to be family friendly? You know, also at a time when all politics is being nationalized, and I get the reason why, we have to start first at the local level. So what can communities do? What is the role of local government in this? Whether in general policy or specifically in how we plan and design that local built environment in the public realm. What are the key levers we should be pulling if we value family? And how can we ensure families are valued to begin with? And I know we have just the panel to answer those questions. So first up, Kevin Faulconer. He's Pepperdine School of Public Policy's visiting professor for community leadership and government innovation. But he also comes to this position, most importantly, after serving as the mayor of San Diego for 2 terms. Before that, council member, before that, business owner, small business owner, dad. Soledad Ursua?
Yes, Ursula.
Excellent. Is a principal at Orinoco Equities and a board member of the Venice Neighborhood Council. She's also a frequent writer and speaker, I think I can say, including at my former haunt, City Journal, the Manhattan Institute. And then last but certainly not least, Seth Kaplan, a professorial lecturer. That's a great title. Professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins SAIS, senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions, a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Center, and a consultant to a whole variety of groups. But most importantly, his next book is coming out, and it's called Fixing Fragile Neighborhoods. So definitely keep an eye out for it. First up, Mayor Faulconer, to you. I want to start with you. So define the challenge for us in building family-friendly communities. Just for all of you listening, we'll have a story in 3 parts. We'll define the challenge. We'll talk about what we need and then where we go from here. But Mayor Faulconer, kick us off.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for each and every one of you being here. Pete, great remarks up front. I was really looking forward to today's session because I think that the answer to your question starts with being intentional about it. Being intentional from a policy standpoint that families and how we interact with each other is extremely important to a healthy city. So what goes into that? And it's not just the built environment, right? And we can talk about that because it is important from parks and others, but that you are doing policies that say you're looking not just to, the 6 months or a year, but how are we going to keep, in my case, San Diegans wanting to stay in San Diego, being able to afford to stay in San Diego. So what are the policies that we're going to help all of that? And so that intentionality, I think, is incredibly important. And then I think it also goes to a recognition that there are some key overriding factors that have to be present to have a family-friendly neighborhood or city. And first and foremost, as Michael and I were talking about, you better darn well have a safe city. Because if you don't have a safe city, ladies and gentlemen, you don't have anything. And I talked about that a lot as mayor. You don't have families that want to stay and raise their kids in your city. You don't have jobs and businesses that want to come and locate and grow. And so I think there are some overriding factors. That is a huge one in my opinion, because a kid has to feel safe walking to school. A mom and her dad has to feel safe if they're out in their neighborhoods or going to their park or to their library. And so you cannot overstate that, I think, because that is one of the biggest things, that people have a choice in a lot of respects of where they can live, where they can afford. And so we spent a lot of time on, as we talked about, trying to spur incentives for housing that San Diegans, Californians can actually afford. It's one of the most expensive states in the country. But also that focus, again, when we talk about families and mom and dad, my kids, went through all the public school system in San Diego. Quality schools is another overriding one that I think makes a huge difference at the local level. Some mayors have more jurisdiction over schools than others. It depends on the city. But I think those are some pretty basic factors that make all the difference in the world for, as I said, that mom and that dad are deciding, where do I want my kids to, where can I afford to live? What are the schools looking like? And do I know that I feel safe? Because if you don't feel safe, in perception and reality, you're not going to have the type of city and environment you need. So I'll pause there to let some of my other folks jump in.
So crime, costs, and classroom issues.
Yeah.
How did you, just a quick follow-up, how did you see your role as mayor at keeping a focus on those issues?
To put forward policies that will make a difference and change that, to use the bully pulpit that I think only a mayor can do, but to say, okay, if crime's important, if neighborhood's important, what are we doing to support good quality men and women in our police force? I had hundreds of folks protesting out in front of my house, all hours of the night, yelling at me and my family, defund the police. I'm like, you can be out there for a year. I'm not defunding the police in San Diego, because we need good quality folks to keep us safe. And I don't care what part of town you live in. So it's being able to stand up and do, in my opinion, not just the what might be the thing of the day or the month. Just as an aside, when I looked at some of my colleagues up and down the state, and I won't name names because then I always get in trouble when they call me. But if I say, they all want, defunded the police, what have they all done now? They can't run fast enough to put money back into their police departments, because if you don't have a safe city, again, you don't have anything. So to put forward policies that make a difference, make a change, we did some pretty, I think, innovative things in San Diego to make it easier to build housing, first and foremost, back to that affordability thing. A lot of people talk about, we need more affordable. Well, how do you make it easier to actually construct it? So what are you going to do in your city to actually make that happen? What are you going to do if you're saying it's important that we have parks? Where's your parks master plan that says we're going to fund it and we're actually going to provide, the services for kids after school to go do that? As a kid, I spent a lot of my summers in our local park and rec center. That's important. That's important to foundations and families. So I think back to where I started, having an intentional aspect of it that says we're going to fund and make changes on the things that are important. Rhetoric is easy, but what are you going to fund? What are you going to put in your budget? What are you going to stand up for? What are you going to do in terms of this is what's going to make a healthy city? Don't fear the debate. Don't fear the back and forth, because I think a lot of the things that I talked about, it's not Republican or Democrat. It's common sense. It's common sense that what do you think that you want to have in your city and what's best for families? And so I think when you have that type of focus, you're easy, to get more consensus that you need to get things approved, but also to have the public support. And I think you can't do anything without that.
That's right. It's one thing to talk the talk on families. It's another thing to walk the walk. And that's the hardest one, but the most important one. Soledad, I want to get to you. What are you seeing in Venice? What are the challenges facing community or facing families in the community where you are?
Hi, and good morning, everyone. So I am a neighborhood council member in Venice Beach. It's a neighborhood in Los Angeles. So I represent sort of the most local form of government in Los Angeles. And prior to COVID, we had 1,900 unsheltered homeless individuals living on our street. So we are only second to that of Skid Row. And when you look at Venice and particularly Los Angeles, what it represents is failed policy. We have a disastrous homeless policy, or just a problem. The latest count showed that we have 69,000 unsheltered homeless individuals in LA County. The number keeps getting worse, even though we spend billions and billions a year on this. And the reason is because our elected officials keep telling us that this is a housing crisis, that it's a manifestation of a housing shortage and capitalism, when really it's a crisis of drug addiction and mental illness. And so when you're somewhere, and you're in Venice, we're talking, this is 3.5 square miles. It's a small community. So there's families that have to walk by encampments on their way to school. There's been needles outside our elementary schools. If you saw in the news a few weeks ago, 3 homes in the Venice canals burnt down. And it was because some transients were doing drugs outside the house and it caught fire. And one of my colleagues on the neighborhood council, he often talks about how frustrated it is to raise small children in Venice. A few months ago, he was dropping off his child, or he was picking up his child at 3 p.m. And across the street, an RV had been parked there. It blew up and it caught fire. And so this is the school line where he's picking up his children. And just a few days earlier, he had discovered a dead body outside the school. So a homeless person had overdosed. So this is what's plaguing young families. Many of my neighbors have left, especially those with young children, where it's not safe. And for people like me, we keep asking for help. We've gone to the city of Los Angeles, the county. What we found is that every elected official has completely failed us. They've all abdicated their responsibilities and they've abandoned us. So many neighborhoods, it's not just in Venice anymore, it's spreading. You're seeing it in all parts of LA, where our elected officials refuse to enforce any kind of laws. They tell us there's nothing that we can do. And we've just seen this problem really metastasize over COVID. And at this point, I really get worried just if we can even start to work it back, because we are seeing people leaving for good. And there's times where sometimes I wonder if I should move. Most people are not out at night. Even in Santa Monica, the businesses are closing earlier and earlier because of the crime. And in effect, that doesn't make things safer. It actually makes it worse. So we have an election coming up. I'm hoping that, people will elect the right people who, are not going to kneel to the chance of defund the police. So LA is really at a crossroads right now.
And so as a quick follow-up, so there's a lot of different people who live in LA. LA is big. Southern California is big. Venice is small. But both within Venice and just broadly within Southern California, what are you seeing are the challenges facing, say, working class families or families with fewer means?
Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that, Venice Beach, that is the beach of working class families. I grew up on the east side. I'm third generation Mexican American, and that's where I would spend my summers because the beach is free. In Venice, we host the world. We host about 10 million annually at our beach, and we're the #2 tourist destination to that of Disneyland. And the beach is free, so this is where families want to be. But look at what we've done, where we've turned the beach, into a major homeless encampment. There's needles on the sand. There's people doing drugs in the bathrooms. And so if you really cared about equity, you would give inner city children safe places to play, free spaces. Most parks, they're being overrun by encampments. And so, the people that are making these, progressive policies, they say they care about equity, but that's not what we're seeing on our streets.
Seth, stepping back for a moment, we're in this phase of defining the challenge, seeing what each of us are seeing in our specific roles. You just finished writing this book in Fragile Neighborhoods. So as part of defining the challenge, tell us, what are fragile neighborhoods and why do they exist?
Thank you. First, let me thank the dean and let me compliment whoever designed this campus. It's amazing to come up here and look. I saw the sunrise. Someone will explain me about the sunrise on the Pacific Ocean sometime, but incredible, incredible. So thank you. So, you know, I work all over the world. People in Washington would know me for fragile states, political transitions, conflict prevention, and the one lesson I will learn over and over again about difference between two countries is on the foundational level, it's the nature of the relationships among the people. So I work, and mostly in places like Libya, Nigeria, Syria, those places in the news that you would rather not go to. Well, part of my job is I sometimes have to go to these places. I was just in Nigeria, for example. And the problem in these places is at a macro level, the groups don't get along, but if you go to the neighborhoods or the communities, very rich institutions, strong families, those places are doing very well. In America, yes, we have some problems, but the thing that strikes you so dramatically, if you compare our daily lives to the lives of people in country after country after country, it's the isolation, it's the disconnection, it's what I would call social poverty. Not material poverty, social poverty. So when I look at this problem, and I think the dean said it very well, that we've fallen into what you might call a vicious cycle. Problems upstream, culture, society affect a lot of downstream things, from education outcomes to health to polarization and deaths of despair, suicide. So if we want to think upstream, this is a vicious cycle that's repeating itself. If you want to change this dynamic, you got to find an entry point. That's what my job is in country after countries. What is an entry point where we could actually make change? And when I think of our problems, they're not up here where everyone talks about them. They're down here in our homes, on our streets, in our neighborhoods. And so I know marriage and family is a great entry point, and I'm for that. But those things are embedded in neighborhoods. And we spend so little time thinking. I think Soledad said it very well. If your neighborhood has problems, you as a family have problems. And so when I talk about fragile neighborhoods as the key issue that we must focus on, I think you could say, broadly speaking, most places in America are much more socially poor than they were 50, 60, 70 years ago. I mean, Nisbet in the 50s was seeing this, but the data says the real change happened in late 60s and from then onward, and lots of data on decline of neighborhoods, decline of social capital, decline of marriage, decline of local institutions. Yet you can see great differences between places. So I believe if we're going to build a new communitarian society, we have to work on the one thing that everyone has in common. We all live in a place. We all depend on the streets around us. That's why I focus on neighborhoods. And I'll just end by saying that there's a wide range of different issues. There are some neighborhoods where you can't find anyone married. You can't find a lot of people, family instability, problems with unsafe streets, and problems with schools, problem with social mobility, shorter lifespans. And so that's one set of problems. But I do believe there's a lot of materially well-off places that may not have the types of things that we've just heard people talk about, but also no one talks to each other. If you have a problem, there's no place you can go. Those places are materially well-off, and they're socially poor, and that's where we get suicides. That's where we get problem with teenagers. That's where we get people who are well off but disconnected, and they take their anger and their alienation out on our politics. So I think this is a problem that affects the great majority of neighborhoods, rich and poor.
Mayor Falcone, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that too. I mean, just teasing out especially that point on rich and poor neighborhoods, both being fragile or facing challenges, but in different ways. Did you see that in San Diego?
Yeah, and I think Seth hit the nail on the head when we talk about creating, a sense of place, creating a place in your neighborhood, not just in your city, but in local neighborhoods that you feel that you want to go to, that you want to gather, you want to be a part of it. And again, and it doesn't have to be huge investment. It could be pocket parks that didn't exist before in an urban environment that a neighborhood didn't have that. It could be planting trees. It could be having better lighting. All of this that creates a sense of I'm going to be prouder of my neighborhood. You know, one of the simplest things on that community pride and character, we had some of the worst roads in San Diego, and I tried to really make that a theory, not just a theory, but a reality of we're going to pave more streets than we ever had. What does a freshly paved street do to how you feel about your, I mean, small little things is what I'm trying to say, make a difference in community. But I do think also there is a role that says, okay, what can we do to encourage that interaction? And when I think back to, some of the things that, for example, the city will be involved in, some folks would say, Mr. Mayor, why are we spending money on arts and culture? Like that, we shouldn't be spending money on arts and culture. We should be spending money on cops, firefighters, all that. Yeah, we should. You're right. Cops and firefighters are important. But it's also important that we have gathering spots and cultural things that bring our neighbors together. And when I think of one that I was involved in, I live in the Point Loma area of San Diego. It was a Point Loma summer concert series that started, I think, about 10 or 15 years from now. That is now the largest gatherings of Point Lomans any time of the year. It's that summer concert series. I would argue that's a good thing. That's a good investment. The city plays a little bit of role. Private donors do most of it. But that's what we want to encourage, is folks to be able to interact in a setting, interacting with their neighbors, seeing the kids run around. That's how you form these connections. That's how you form these bonds. And I think that is a important role to try for us as policymakers to help, to help foster that and to do that. And again, back to that, being intentional about creating either these programs or these senses of place that gets people out and interacting. Soledad was talking about COVID, and that's just been, awful on the human scale for folks that, whether you're at work, whether you're others, to get back out. And so I think there's an even more sense of urgency for all of us. Again, when we're looking at existing communities, we're looking at communities that haven't had that share of investment. Okay, how are we going to be, again, back intentional that says we want to create places that neighbors and families can actually be a part of and are going to want to do that. Investment spurs more investment, and being smart about how you do that.
And Soledad, I want to turn to you for a quick response, because we've heard a couple of different challenges. So one that Seth was pointing to, I'm going to put words in your mouth. Actually, these are Scott Winship's words, but an isolation of affluence. So you have this dynamic, we just become sort of a wealthier society, and that changes, we don't need to borrow sugar or flour from our neighbor. We can just get it delivered from Amazon. One day we'll have it delivered by drones or something. So there's sort of like one challenge there. And then there's all these other maybe challenges that poor or working class families face. And there's just challenges that are now facing all of us right now, whether it's cost or crime or education or what have you. Soledad, the mayor mentioned COVID. How did you see COVID, though? So given all of these challenges, how did you see COVID hit Venice, and then the public policy response to it affect community?
That's terrible.
So for Los Angeles, COVID was probably the most disastrous in that the CDC made recommendations that we should fully or partially suspend many of our municipal codes. And so that is really when you started to see this proliferation of tents and RVs. Due to COVID, they wanted to give people the ability to shelter in place. In fact, there was no sheltering in place going on. But if you drive along the streets of Venice, you'll notice many RVs, and they've been there in that same spot since March of 2020. Because now under COVID, you cannot tow a vehicle that's used for a domicile purpose. Additionally, before COVID, we had a rule that tents had to be down during the day. You could only have a tent up if it was colder than 50 degrees out or at night. And so we've stopped enforcing that. And for the police, it has been incredibly hard for them because criminals have now moved in. They're going to supply drugs to, their group of, the people there who are consuming drugs. So it's a huge market now. There's fights on the boardwalk over, just dominating the drug trades there. And then for the police, they must treat a tent as its private property. So if they are chasing after a suspect and he goes into his tent and zips it up, they can't go in there after him. They need to get a search warrant. So COVID has been this disastrous response where the police cannot do their jobs. And so, we keep asking for more help, and really, we won't be able to enforce any of our laws until Governor Newsom gives up his emergency powers. So we'll see if he ever does that. But until then, we can't enforce any of our laws.
I see you leaning in.
I know how you've structured the panel, so we're getting ready for the ball.
We'll start with Seth.
He reveals the truth.
I'm not Kyle Schwarber, so it's not going 490. I'm not a Phillies fan either. But anyway.
And by the way, for all of you, please be thinking of questions, because I want to make sure we get in question time. And we'll have some microphones around the room, I think. All right, so real quick. So let's shift to what do we need. So we talked about the challenges. What do we need? Seth, I actually want to turn to you first. So when you're looking at the social infrastructure, how can we strengthen the social infrastructure? What immediately comes to mind to you?
Okay, so I'm going to take that in two ways. The easy answer is parks, libraries, what we might call third places. Third places could be anything from a bar to a coffee shop to simply any place that people can gather. I mean, churches, for example, for sure, but civic associations. It used to be relationships are not built by magic. You need to find places where you meet and you form associations, you form trust. Also, you practice being civically engaged. People are angry because they haven't practiced dealing with each other in their neighborhoods. That's how I look at it. But let me also say on a bigger level, my neighborhood is full of institutions. It happens to be that there's 6 synagogues there, and I can walk down the streets and I can nearly name who lives in what house, how many kids they have, what they've done to their kitchen, what my wife doesn't like about their kitchen. I can go through that because it's where we have a community school which opened in September of that first year of COVID. No one in a community with a community school is going to keep their school closed if they have a choice in the matter. To be very honest, it happens to be a non-public. So you can make such decisions. But if you're building social infrastructure, there's the physical, and I would say there's the non-physical, which is the wealth of institutions. I mean, we talk about we've outsourced our relationships to Amazon and all these apps. In my neighborhood, we haven't. And so we need to do things, whether it's encouraging neighborhood councils, for example, whether it's, some people would say neighborhood quarterbacks, whether it's, I mean, we give tax refunds for investing in nonprofits. Why not find ways to encourage more money going into social institutions that are local? And I would just say, on the bigger picture, if we made neighborhood the central design principle for how we thought about to build a society, government would work differently. Government is not a social institution, but it tends to be one of the most important, if not the most institution or set of institutions. So I would, if you go to a big city like LA, I don't know LA, I'm from New York, we don't have any government structure below the government of the city. 8 million people in New York City's case. So why don't we have a governing structure of some nature with power, with flexibility to spend money? And why don't we redesign government so it's not about how many units you built, if you're the housing department, but how well you built up the neighborhoods? Yeah. Why is education about public schools and not the learning environment where every child is day in and day out? And a lot of that is not in schools. So if you had different mandates and different structures of government and you had a different lens, it would impact so many things in our society.
Mayor Falconer, I feel like everything Seth said was a pitch right down the middle to you. So you've been in elected office, and if I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you started out in public service because you cared about parks, especially one in your neighborhood. So talking about everything that Seth just said, I feel like you've tackled it, not just parks, but neighborhood councils and neighborhood visions. How do you respond?
And I agree. That's where the rubber meets the road. To the extent that you can empower local decision making with the emphasis on local, literally at the I was a city council member before I was mayor, and I started as a volunteer on our city's park and rec board. because I was upset that the city was basically taking money out of Mission Bay, which is one of our great resources in San Diego, both environmentally and for families to enjoy the water, and siphoning the revenue out of that, spending it on everywhere else except back where they should to help that park. I said, I'm probably not alone in that. And ultimately ran for city council and got elected, and et cetera. So I think that focus on hyper-local is important because that's what people care about. That is what families care about. I mean, that is it. It is about good quality schools. It's about school choice. I mean, giving parents that ability to do that. And again, what I said earlier, I just firmly believe if you don't have a safe city or safe neighborhoods, the rest doesn't matter. And so that is so incredibly important. You know, Soledad was talking about, we were talking earlier, you have to have the political will to stand up. What is missing on some of this? Michael, having the political will to make decisions that some folks on Twitter or others may not like. Okay, that's what's kind of changed a lot of this political dynamic these days. We took a pretty different stance in San Diego on the issue of homelessness because I was tired of the city and county fighting, you know, whose responsibility was it, et cetera. So set up a series. I said, look, I'm mayor. These are my streets. We better do some things different. I probably spent more time on the issue of homelessness my last 2 years as mayor than any other topic.
It was easy. You got no pushback whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Incredible pushback. You're never sure if you're doing the right thing. But what I knew is we have to intervene. What I knew is it's not okay to allow somebody to sleep on a tent in a sidewalk in front of your house, in front of your business, in front of your school. We made that change. We said you can't do that in San Diego. I believe that every human being has a right to shelter. I also believe that when we provide that, you have an obligation to use it. I enforced that obligation as mayor. Again, I believe we have to intervene to give people help, to give people support, and I think we had some success in that as the only big city in California where our homeless numbers actually went down by double digits. So that political will, I believe, is incredibly important, and I strongly believe it's common sense. You know, Democrats and Republicans equally and independents don't like stepping over needles and feces to get to their house or to get to their school. And so, you know, we're focusing a lot on that because it is probably the issue in California cities right now. I know we have folks from all over the country, but a lot of it is start with, do you have the political will to make the change? It says it's not okay. The status quo is not okay. If you love somebody enough, let's love them enough not to let them die in our streets and our sidewalks. And that's, I think, when you can get to that, that is pro-family, that is pro-neighborhood, and that's, at the end of the day, I think what, I had a lot of pushback, but it's when people saw that it started to work, then guess what? You're going to get that buy-in. You're going to get that support.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Soledad, when you and I were talking before this panel, you said something that I thought I wanted to raise here. You said local leaders should respect families. So when I asked you about policy, you said policy's good. We need to get that right. But we need to see that local leaders respect families. What did you mean by that?
I think it's really just respecting their views. In City Hall today in Los Angeles, there's this huge push by these progressive voices. And it's time for leaders to really listen to families and listen that, you know, we just want law and order to be upheld. When you look at what's going on in Los Angeles, you know, we have a big election coming up. The Democratic Socialists of America have run an incredible slate. They've gotten quite a few of their candidates on. And we're in a position where the LA City Council could actually flip and become majority socialist. So I think elected officials really need to start listening to family members because the views of these, it's really the minority of these progressive voices. When I'm walking around Venice, everyone that I talk to and meet with, you know, they don't believe this. So it's this small progressive view that has sort of dominated, you know, all the talking points and all the policy now is being pushed by them. And they appear much larger than they are. But that's sort of what's happening where we have elected officials who are caving and buckling to their demands. And they're still calling for defund the police.
Mm. So Seth, a quick follow-up to you. And by the way, so I've been told there are note cards actually on your table. So if you have questions, write them down on the note card, wave them up in the air, and someone will come by and pick them up. So I definitely want to get to your questions because I know you have a lot on your mind. So we've talked about a range of issues that are sort of always within the local governance bucket. So maybe it's housing, maybe it's crime, maybe it's education. Education is also a bit of a state issue. So there are issues that are already on the agenda at the local level that I hear you saying should be family focused, or we should think about how they impact families. I've also heard us talk about how we talk about families and how we treat families generally. So our messaging and our posture and our care for families should be different. But Seth, what is there a menu of items that at the local level we can say, this is new, this is specifically addressed toward families? So one thing that, I'll always hear is like, in New York, it was, a mom is going to struggle to carry her kid down a stairwell onto a subway platform. And that whole process of just going from the street level down to the subway platform feels actively hostile to a new mom. And so we can design that specifically for families. At least that's something that was raised to me once. So Seth, what comes to mind specifically at the local level that we can say, this is a family agenda?
Well, as a dad, I've also tried to carry the stroller down the subways in New York, and it's not very easy. So I'll just say dads also struggle with that. And there's no subways in my neighborhood, by the way.
Yes.
So there's no subways in where I live. There's just lots of houses. So, I mean, I think this idea, I'm thinking always of place. Everything goes around. I mean, you mentioned before that people outsource in my neighborhood because there's a dense set of network and a dense set of relationships and a dense set of institutions. If I have a problem, I can recall my daughter once dropped her brother, and that wasn't very good, especially because he landed on cement. And immediately we needed to find a nurse. Well, my wife's antenna peaked up, and immediately we knew, she knew like 6 nurses that were literally walking distance or within a 3 minutes drive of my house, because we know all of our neighbors. So for me, it goes back. Yes, there are broader issues that help families, but for me, the foundational thing is, and this is about going back to basics, and I think we as a society have forgotten the basics. We're up here with nice ideas, but the basics are, I mean, we've talked about it, but you know your neighbors, you have a thick, dense web of supporting systems and infrastructure. Your schools are very responsive to your needs. I mean, in my neighborhood, because we have such a thick, dense web, everyone has lots of kids. Is if people have things they don't need, they give it to what we would call some institution, and they lend it out. So we have all these institutions to help people in terms of getting secondhand things and what have you. But the key issue is, I mean, you need mechanisms to bring people together, strengthen the family and strengthen the interfamily networks. That would mean community schools. That would mean third places where people meet each other. I mean, I'm talking about this web. For me, the most important thing is the web of institutions, the web of norms. We as a society, to the extent that we elevate marriage, family, and giving to your neighborhood and giving to your neighbors as aspirations, that the American dream is not just that big house where I can buy everything online, but the American dream is more than the material. It's also this thing about giving to others in family, streets, neighborhood, institutions in our neighborhood. That would make a tremendous difference.
So we have so many good questions that have just flooded in. This is terrific. I love to see this. All right, so first one, Seth, maybe you have some thoughts on this. Others, feel free to weigh in. But it's sort of a fundamental question. The question is, what is a family and how has it changed? So maybe just to tease that out a little bit. When we talk about families being foundational in society, are we talking about the nuclear family? Are we talking about sort of multi-generational presence? And then also the makeup of families have changed. Marriage rates have changed. So give us a sense from your perspective of what we mean by family and how those may have been changing.
Well, I would say in America, the definition of family, the definition of community, anything that's relational seems to have changed dramatically in America. I mean, when we say community, I don't think we actually know what community is anymore. Community for many people can be virtual my friends from school. They're all over the country. We talk regularly. That's my community. That is not a community. I'm sorry. A community involves sacrifice, giving, responsibility, and for the most part, not 100%, for the most part, it must be place-based. So when you talk about family, for me, foundationally, a family is everybody who's taking care on the day in, day out level of a child. For me, it's very much about children. I mean, our society has very different ideas, but that would in the ideal case would be parents, would be extended relatives. I mean, in my neighborhood, we have 3 generations. In some case, if I'm thinking of the people who live across from me, the Francos, wonderful people, president of my synagogue in previous years. His parents live in the neighborhood, and some of his children live in the neighborhood, and they have kids. So you got certainly multi-generational extended, certainly parents, to the extent that we promote family stability, to the extent we promote closer families, I would say all of that. I think as a society and culture, we've got away from that, and I can see cases where other things would be important, but the more we get back, and there's lots of data, the more you get back to this foundation of what a family is, and that people are making compromises and sacrifices for children, and it's children-centered, that to me would be the healthiest situation. Not that it's easy to get there, by no means, where we are today.
Soledad, you should know I've got a stack of 3 question cards right here, all directed to you, and all kind of on a similar theme. So I'll just kind of group them together, if that's all right. So this question says, in a society whose residents have increasingly become reliant on government leadership to fix problems, what can be done to empower local residents to fix problems, to be included, or to just be included and involved in improving their neighborhoods? On a similar level, what does a neighborhood council do, and why should people run for it? And similarly, like, are HOAs part of the picture too? So talk to us about that kind of hyper-local involvement.
Well, we have 15 city council members, and we have 99 neighborhood councils. LA is a city of 4 million. In a perfect world, our council member would listen to the neighborhood councils. We are basically an advocate for residents. I have the power of making recommendations. Unfortunately, we have a progressive council member, Mike Bonin, who has not shown any interest in working with the Venice community or really upholding any of the laws on our books. And to the first question, I think that what's happened recently is we don't actually rely on the government anymore. I feel like I've come to know all of my neighbors in Venice because we need to rely on each other so much. We will contact each other when, I've called the police when I've seen my neighbor's home being broken into. And so we know each other's cars, we're looking out for each other. I just put up security cameras, and so we're often working together because of this increase in crime. And, there's people who have been attacked on the streets, and so we've actually really come together as a community to look out for one another and sort of create our own neighborhood watch. Because if you call the police, you might be put on hold if you call 911. If you're calling about a break-in, you could be waiting for about 2 hours. So unless you have a life-threatening emergency, no one is going to show up. So in this case, we've actually have created a very strong community. We're all working together because we feel very much alone.
Mm-hmm. And I can also just tell you from personal experience. So one of the questions was just like, should you get involved locally, and what are some avenues to do it? Like, well, it will look different where you are, but yes, yes, you should. So these questions, Mayor Falconer, I'm just going to group them together for you. So they fall into 2 buckets that are related in the conversation today: housing and homelessness. Obviously, those are distinct challenges. But the first one was, can you tell us a little bit about your attempts to change zoning and land use to make housing more affordable? Also talk about homeless policies. What are some examples of what you did to clear encampments, help the unhoused long term? And then, how did you include mental health care for the homeless? So the housing discussion and the homeless discussion.
Well, for the next 45 minutes, I will
buckle
go
up.
through each of those. Hard to give quick answers, but I'll do my best. First and foremost, local land use. Cities have the ability for land use, right? So where do we want to build housing, and probably just as importantly, where do you not want to do that? And so we did, and in fact, it was the focus of our class last week here. We did something called Complete Communities, where we did a citywide environmental impact report to get away from some of the challenges of CEQA and using that as a weapon for those of you in California.
CEQA being, for anybody who doesn't
California
know.
Environmental Quality Act. It stops good projects too often. But so we said, okay, we're gonna do this, and I'm gonna say, here's where we want the density. We'll do all of this planning. Took it through the city council, got it supported. So now you can come in and get a permit by right to do that, right? To help get the process moving faster, because time is money. The government doesn't build houses, the private sector does. So we need to make it easier to do that. We also did some unique things that says, if you're gonna be next to transit corridors and you're building new apartments or condominiums, you can choose whether you want to build parking or not for that. So think about that. Parking structures involved in these high risers can add about $85,000 to $90,000 for the cost of the unit. We'll say, we're gonna let you decide if you wanna do that, if you're close to a transit. And guess what? People are responding, and that's working. It's helping to drive down some of the costs in the urban areas where that makes sense. So it was trying to be a little bit different and unique and innovative, again, with the goal of, you have to increase the supply. And too often folks will say, I want more housing, I just don't want it right there. I just don't want it right here. So part of that is having these conversations on the local and neighborhood level to say, let's have the fight once, in theory, if you can, and then move on. In the area of homelessness, I didn't pretend to, if you looked at when I first got elected, homelessness was an issue, nowhere near what it was when, towards the end. And so we did some unique things that, like setting up bridge shelters and others, that wasn't just a bed for the night, but it was housing navigators on site to help match people with, what's it going to take to help you get into that apartment, whether you're a veteran, whether you're others, what HUD issues do you have? We had, for example, mental health providers on site. Soledad hit the nail on the head. Exactly what we're seeing is a crisis of substance abuse and mental health on the streets. So trying to put all of that together, but then also back to our quality of life, insisting that we have a bottom line in our city. I created a new division within the San Diego Police Department called the Neighborhood Policing Division, whose sole focus was on homelessness and quality of life. And it became a division that the men and women in our department wanted to be a part of, because they knew they had the political support. They knew they had community support once it started. And it was all about, hey, how are we going to help people, but also insist that we're not going to allow encampments in our cities where you do have the problems of not just the drug abuse, sexual abuse, all kinds of violence that happens in these encampments. And so we took a stand. And one of my captains who was in that division had the greatest line, and I use it all the time because it's true. He says, the cops don't have to be the front line. We should, in fact, have outreach workers. We should have all the things that we have, and to go out and on the streets and make a difference. But there has to be a bottom line. And if you do not enforce a bottom line, you're not going to have the types of communities that are family friendly, that help people the most on the street, to say, we care enough to intervene. And so that, I think, was a sea change that we started in San Diego. I think it had a pretty positive effect. There's a lot of other things we did. But again, it starts from that the change, if you will, that says we're going to intervene. We're going to intervene because if somebody is high on heroin, meth, or fentanyl, you're probably not in the best position to make a decision. We're going to come help and intervene and insist we do something different. Not everybody agreed with that position. I stand by it 1,000%, because we care about people enough to make a difference. And I think that's probably one of the key differences that we did in San Diego that I think other cities are starting to emulate now.
Mayor Falcon, I'm going to stick with you for just a moment, then Soledad, next to you. So two questions, I'll include them together. So A, how do you lead locally when the state's telling you what to do? And B, why don't we see more conservatives involved locally, especially in running for office?
I think we're seeing that more, the second part of your question. And I think as people, look, one-party rule, in my humble opinion, is not working in California. And I think people want that competition of ideas. I think people want, if I say, if you think the status quo is great, keep going that same direction. You're seeing now even more Democrats in this state saying, well, this is not the Democratic Party that I am a part of. And so I think that competition of ideas, that pendulum is going to swing back to a more common sense focus. And I think that's when you're going to get increasingly more candidates, more conservative candidates, more common sense candidates. They're going to say, hey, this is what we should be doing. What was the first part of that question?
How can you lead locally when the state's telling you what to do?
Yeah, that's tough because the state will come in and push a bunch of regulations on you and say, we want you to go do it, and we're not going to give you any money to do it. But
I'm sorry, by the way. I mean, I work in state government now.
Yeah, I know.
So
He's the governor. So give us the freedom, the flexibility, and the resources, and we will. No, but it's the give and take that you need to do. But I'm a big believer on local control. Back to if we're talking about families, if we're talking about communities, your local folks, your neighborhood councils, your city councils, your mayors are going to be in a much better position to help define what that looks like rather than somebody in a distant capital. So I will always push against that virtually every chance I get.
I love it. Soledad, this is a really thoughtful question from Noah. So much of our lives are lived away from our neighborhoods. We're so busy, always gone. How do we encourage people to stay in their neighborhood? And also tack on to that, what do you do in your neighborhood when folks are like, we're packing up, we're moving to Tennessee, or sorry, I had to do that. Yeah, how do you respond to that too?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people move, and it's sad, when they move out of state. It's mostly people with young children. They're the first to go because, they're starting to ask themselves if they're a good parent for having their children there. So I keep telling people to hold on, and, with the new elections, we'll get better representation. So that's really all that we can ask for, is to just get better local representation. We have city council races, is it next week? Yeah, the election. So I tell people to hold on, that we have to keep holding our ground, and we'll see something turn around. But I think to keep people, in their neighborhoods, it's just really common sense items, but and there are things that we have to fight so hard for. We have to fight for street sweeping. We have to fight for, clearing encampments and the junk and the debris, because activists show up and they say that those are actually the personal belongings of a homeless person. So it's just so hard to get just trash off of your streets. I've had to clean up human feces in my driveway 3 times now. So it's so absurd what, I think people are shocked to hear this, but that's just the condition of Los Angeles, and especially in Venice. But I think there's a real movement shifting where people have had enough of these, crazy policies. Everybody that I run into now we're all on board. Yesterday I got my hair cut in Santa Monica at this very hip and trendy place. And my hairstylist was wearing all leather, and she had piercings, tattoos, and pink hair. So I didn't think we'd have much to chit-chat about. But she starts telling me about how frustrated she is with the businesses closing earlier and earlier. And that actually makes things more dangerous. She had been assaulted by a homeless woman, and she has to go file a police report the day after. When she gets off work, and she said, are you going to vote for Rick Caruso? I was like, yeah, I'm voting for him too. So, right away, I found out we have that in common. So I think people love love LA, and we just want change. We're tired of, career politicians and the status quo. So I think we might see some surprising results after the election.
And she did a good job with your hair.
Thank you.
So final section, where do we go from here? Soledad, just to stick with you, give us the hopeful story. So let's say you do begin. I know it's always so tough in the midst of the fight. What gives you hope at the local level, and what would you love to see 5-10 years from now?
Well, I'm
for
hopeful
families,
because this can be solved. I love Venice Beach. When I first moved there, I had just come from New York, and it was the perfect place where you don't need a car. I like to ride a bike. Your neighbors. It's very small and quaint, and the beach, everybody wants to come visit you and hang out and go to brunch. So it's a perfect neighborhood, and we've just seen it, erode. But I am hopeful because this situation, this problem, it can be fixed if we just look at it the right way through the prisms of, mental illness and drug addiction. So we just need the will to do it. And I'm from Los Angeles, a native Los Angelino. I love it. So it's sad to have lived in New York for 9 years and come back and see what happened to the city, because this isn't the city that I grew up in. And I'm very hopeful that it will come back eventually.
And you know what it once was and why you're here. Seth, When you talk not about fragile neighborhoods, but strong neighborhoods, where in America, or maybe abroad, do you look to for hope and for examples of what we can be building toward?
I think there's two types of neighborhoods today that continue to do very well. There's neighborhoods that are oriented, that have a lot of strong religious institutions. I mean, I'm thinking my neighborhood, but I can think of other neighborhoods, certainly neighborhoods with strong Christian churches and institutions and a history and culture of a strong civic engagement that sort of intermix with the religion. It may not be through the church, but it's simply the church culture has encouraged people to be deeply involved in their communities. And you can certainly find that in certainly parts of rural America and in some places in the Midwest. So that's one set. The other set is you certainly have some very liberal places, like I'm thinking Bethesda, which is not, or Chevy Chase, which is not far from me. And there's a place with so many thick institutions and so many people engaged. They tend to be small. They tend to be organized around lots of giving and engaging to your neighborhood. I mean, I don't know if Venice would qualify because I don't know Venice very well, but places where there's a lot of local institutions and people are stepping up to be a member of this organization and that association. So you can find that, but what the problem is, these things used to be everywhere. I mean, Alan Earnhardt wrote a really great book. This is in the 90s, looking at Chicago in the 50s versus the 90s and how much of a decline there was in neighborhoods, and that's already 25 years ago. I think that is more the norm. And the exception, the mostly very liberal, high amount of civil engagement, and then more conservative with strong religious institutions. And that's not quite two buckets, but that gives you two examples. And then we have a whole lot of other places that don't fit into either category, and we see a lot of decay today, unfortunately.
And we can read all about it in your new book.
Thank you. You're
Yes.
hired as the PR agent.
Mayor Falconer, take us home. Where can we and should we look to for hope in making America and its communities more family-friendly for the future?
Well, at the end of the day, it's people that make the difference. Yeah. It's not going to be the state. It's going to be, those of us in this room and everybody in neighborhoods that care about it and to say, Venice is worth fighting for. California is worth fighting for. San Diego, I mean, it's worth fighting for. And so I'm actually fairly optimistic, as much as we've talked about a lot of the problems that we all face, because as Pete was talking about his introduction, this kind of great American experiment of self-governance is pretty important. And there's not going to be somebody that comes in and saves the day. It's us. It's people. And so I think the focus on what we are doing at the local level, on the family level, is the answer to that question, Michael, because everybody's busy. Everybody is going to work. Everybody's doing stuff, but it's too darn important not to. And so the solution lies in getting involved, saying, if I don't like what's going on, I'm going to push on my councilman. I'm going to push on that mayor. What the heck are you doing, brother? And let's make some. That's, I think, that lies in the communities that can make change when it's not happening. It tends to not happen quickly in our system, right? It takes too long sometimes. And sometimes things have to get so bad that the house is on fire that people say enough's enough. But I think people are saying enough's enough a lot. So again, I do think that pendulum is swinging back. And I'm actually fairly optimistic that the seeds of making a difference are based upon our neighborhoods, based upon families who are making that stake in the ground and says, this place is worth it. And when we can encourage that, then I think we see the change.
And with that, let's give our panel a round of applause.
Thank you. Good ending there.
Thank you. Thank you, Soledad. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll take a